There we go. Next thing you know, there we go. Got it. But yeah, to kind of give you an idea, we're getting closer and closer to getting our 2024 analysis done. I think it really surprised me, obviously young in my career, even in 2023, um, how well really liquidity positions really were. I think we're going to see those down. I'm sure, Cal, y'all have seen those in renewals as far as ending inventories. I've certainly seen it. Income taxes. Not a lot of people are thinking about that for 2024 because I sold all my grain and I'm not sitting on any in ending inventory. Looking at 2025, kind of the same old poor us scenario with persistent drought. I'd also add that we're still seeing inflation, in particular in our input costs, and overall just a lot of uncertainty going forward, right? Obviously in price, I like what Kyle said. We think we know what it is, but we really don't know, right? The same could be true. I think we're kind of entering this era of ad hoc government payments too, and I don't really like it from an economist perspective because it's increasing uncertainty, and we've got enough volatility in our farm economy already, right? And so there's actually just a report I read this morning. USDA put out a report that actual net farm and net cash farm income for 25 is expected to be the highest since it had been in 22. What do you think that is? Well, these government payments, right? We're sitting at the $10 billion, right, for emergency assistance program. We got another $10 billion that we're estimated for ARC and PLC, and then the disaster payments we're looking at, 22 to $23 billion. So $42 billion is a lot of money, in comparison to some of the recent years. The thing I don't like about it is, we know where the emergency assistance program should come, right? The 30 or 90, 60 days, right? But the emergency or the disaster payments don't really know what that's going to look like. I don't like it because I'm an economist. I like things fixed, right? So again, a lot of uncertainty. You could add in the tariffs and potential for retaliatory tariffs in that equation too. So in regard to land values, I feel like they've been a little bit inflated, in part due to government payments, right? Where are we spending this money at? There's a lot of evidence that shows we typically put that into land values, right? What do we do if I, get an ERP payment? Well, that increases my likelihood to go out and purchase land. But we're still in this environment, right, where we really don't have the net farm income necessarily to support these land values. So lastly, as far as the machinery equipment market, it can be viewed as a crisis or an opportunity, right? If you have the working capital to be able to go out and buy machinery, there might be some likelihood that you can get some pretty good deals on that. Again, uncertainty there too as well. So with all that, I think the biggest thing is control what you can control. I'd also add there was a study by Dr. Rodney Jones once. He had some ties with farm management that essentially saying control what you can control, and a lot of times we're trying to control things that are out of our hands. I don't know what the tariff's going to do, or if China's going to retaliate, right? But I can use my crop price risk management tools, right, to be able to help protect me, certainly in very uncertain times. So the only reason we ever bring up weathermen as economists, because they're the only career that's worse at predicting than we are. So this is the NOAA outlook here. We've got January 14th issued, so they probably had one out in February as well. But this is April, May, June outlook. Precipitation here on the left side. Of course, where are we sitting at here? Below equal chances. I always hear Lucas Haig say, what's average for Western Kansas? It's like that average doesn't exist, right?
Setting on a dryer.
Yeah, that's right. It's a setting on a dryer, right? And temperature-wise too, equal to above average on temperature. Again, we've historically kind of always pointed out, we always tend to look exactly where, where we're at, Thomas County, right? But we tend to not look at our competitive markets, at least in the domestic production realm, right? So could be some problems here getting corn planted, for instance, here up in the Midwest. But again, it's looking like pretty favorable in terms of what they may be able to produce there. Yet later, here's the July, August, September. Again, precip on the left, we're below average. In our area, and they're equal chances with reasonable temperature. So I think it's always important. I think we get in our silos of looking, well, what do I look at in western Kansas? Well, yes, it's important, but it's also important to look outside of our silo to determine, what's really going to affect what, in a lot of cases, what my bottom line is going to look like. So moving on to the actual, discussion on lease arrangements. We've got a couple different ones here. We've got a dry land, wheat, corn, milo, fallow rotation, using KFMA data. And so, I know prices have come up since then, but it's more so about determining what an equitable lease arrangement is versus, well, what's my net returns? It looks pretty harsh when you throw all the economic costs in there too as well. So obviously have all these cash expenses, right? But then we also have the addition of economic costs. And you say, well, Glenn, you idiot, why do you care about economic costs? What are economic costs? There are things like management depreciation or opportunity cost to your time, right? If you're just looking at those two things, if I'm not covering that cost, right? The way I always put it is I'm doing it for fun, right? And I'm wearing out equipment. Well, you can go flip burgers at Mickey D's and make more money if you can't even cover the opportunity cost of your time or your machinery, right? So again, that management depreciation, again, just to give you an idea on that, we're taking a salvage value and applying it to capital investments, and over time we're using that depreciation expense rather than Section 179 for tax purposes, right? So important differentiation there. In this first example, we have kind of an example for Cheyenne, Rawlins, Decatur, Thomas, Sheridan County. Again, using a base rent land charge of $60 here. There's a couple different ways you can look at coming to a determinable equitable lease arrangement. I always figure start with an equitable crop share lease, right, and then back out a cash rent. That's really the easiest. But in this format of this KSU budget, you have to force essentially a base cash rent. So if you figure, we're assuming, right, $60 base rent is $3,000 land value at 2%, right? So I think with Mark using that 2%, I think long term it's probably closer to 1.5% to 2%. I think that's a little optimistic in my opinion, but that's giving you a basis as to the assumptions we're using in this example. All right, so let's see here. Of course, we get here this first example in the purple. We have the tenant's share in this rotation, right? The red is the landlord share in this rotation. And then the blue is a cash rent equivalent to the landlord, right? And then the green is a max cash rent. So in this first example we have here at 100% cost, we're saying we're somewhere around that 77 to 33% equitable lease arrangement, right? When the tenant is covering all the costs, right? So if we move into this example of the landlords helping out with their share of the fertilizer costs, we're closer to this 72%, right? In this example. Funny enough, we actually, Mark had me put together a poll at Cover Your Acres, And I was really surprised at the lack of how many landlords were paying their share of fertilizer and chemical, or excuse me, including the chemical specifically. I know it's probably a wide range because, you know, um, the equitable lease arrangement in a 2/3, 1/3 with the landlord paying their share of the fertilizer and chemical, it's probably a scenario where, you know, maybe they're not paying for the chemical costs across the fallow, but they are at least on the growing crops, right? So um, again, that's where we get close to that 2/3, 1/3, with them sharing the landlord sharing their share of the fertilizer and chemical, right? Um, Obviously, in this rotation, with the prices we had utilized and relatively high input costs, right, we're sitting at a loss from an economic perspective, right? But really, we're at, you know, what we're trying to get at is, as we're trying to get these returns, even if they're lost, they're equal across the landlord and the tenant, right? Uh, this next example just uses a fixed 2/3 across those different factors of, you know, 100% of the cost is all on the tenant. Landlord's paying their share of the fertilizer, and then the landlord's paying their share of the fertilizer and the chemicals. So again, seeing here, you know, we're somewhere that fertilizer and chemical is by our estimation somewhere near an equitable lease arrangement. So you know, factors that really go into this are land values. Obviously a landlord's wanting a certain percent return on investment, right? Well, you know, in this example, again, you know, $3,000 an acre at, you know, 2% gives us what, 60 to 60 bucks an acre. So the next one I've got here is kind of a western end, right, where we have a wheat corn fallow. Again, I know these prices are probably a little bit higher now. The costs are probably going to be, those are going to be pretty accurate with what we had for farm management level data here. So again, looking at this in the form of a equitable share lease, we're close to that 80/20. You know, when the landlord is not paying any of the expenses, right? Again, paying their share of the fertilizer. That's that kind of, you know, almost a 3/4, 1/4 here in this example, in this rotation. And then close, still 72% on the landlord paying their share of the fertilizer and chemical. The important thing there, if you're a landlord or a tenant, is always think in terms of the risk management. All we're doing in any lease arrangement is, you know, distributing risk, right? And so a lot of times, I know that may be hard, in particular from a landlord perspective, to pay some of the share of the chemical, but in the end, any input that is being added to the production cycle that in theory should increase yield, there's going to be some share in there that we're going to need to you know, allocate risk in that nature. So what's the next one I got here? Actually, I'll go back here again. Here, kind of on the western end, used a base rent here of $40. Reason being there is, again, about that 2% return on investment, but on $1,800 ground rather than, you know, $3,000. So again, assuming most people are probably this 2/3 to 1/3, again, we're seeing something at or near that fertilizer and chemical shared by the landlord as a equitable lease arrangement in this example. So let's see here. Last one, we kind of did one that's Eastern. We threw beans in here. I'd probably disagree with Mark on this 45 bushel yield following the beans, but still yet, getting Eastern, I know in Oklahoma it was for every mile you drove, for every 17 miles you drive east in the state of Oklahoma, you gain an inch of annual precipitation. Well, they can throw their beans in their rotation, obviously, here. So it's almost like our limiting factor is, moisture out here. Looking at this example again, still in a dry land rotation, we're kind of seeing, they're close to that, 80-20 lease arrangement under a arrangement where the tenant's paying 100% of the cost, 70-30 when the landlord is paying their share of the fertilizer, and again close to that 2/3, 1/3 on in terms of when the landlord's paying their share of the fertilizer and chemicals. So again here used a higher base cash rent in these calculations just because hey, we're assuming higher land values further east, right? We're thinking Phillips County even further east in our association, right? So I think we have, here's a 2/3 example. Again, just kind of showing the differences between the landlord and the tenant, and who's sharing their portion of the cost. Right here with the landlord paying their share of the fertilizer and chemical, we're showing that is an exact equitable lease arrangement in this example, having them pay that fertilizer and chemical or their share of. So here we were again at Cover Your Acres. We were kind of in a broad painting with broad brush here. The two examples I really want to point out here is we may not have beans in our rotation out here, but the key still being that we're looking at what's an equitable lease arrangement, right? And how does that differ when the landlord owns the sprinkler versus the tenant, right? And I certainly appreciate Mark's experience. 38 years at farm management. He's seen a lot, and so I think it's more common probably down in Wallace County. And the example he gave me, right, was what you'd often see was it was all in-furrow or flood irrigated, right? And then the landlord didn't want to, he didn't want to go buy a sprinkler, and so he said, well, you can keep farming this, and I'll let you buy the sprinkler. So I think it's a little more common further down there. Again, I think Kyle wasn't too very far off on his corn. That $800. I think you were $850 per acre on total expenses. So again, it feels like we really haven't seen a huge decline in input prices, right? It still shocks me what corn is a bag even after discounts, and it makes me a little nervous too. 25 is going to be interesting because I know a lot of folks not knowing the lack of moisture, right? I don't know how many acres I'm going to plant, right? They don't prepay, they don't get that discount. That kind of makes me a little nervous, right? Heading into 25 and what that 25 production year might even look like too. So in this example, this irrigated example with the landlord owning the sprinkler, again, here we have, it's close to that 70-30 when the tenant is paying 100% of the cost. You'll notice we have this additional bar, this corn bushel lease. I have very, very few of my members that use it. I think one or two off the top of my head that utilize it. I don't know, it works okay. I think landlords really like it because I know, hey, I can get to my 200 bushel an acre, $200 cash rent value with a 40 bushel rent with $5 corn, right? The thing I don't really like about it, I guess, from a tenant's perspective is, right, in this example, you're not giving them bushels, you're still cutting that cash rent check, usually utilizing a predetermined price point, right, or an agreed upon location or value that you're going to use for the price, but you get to your $200 cash rent on irrigated ground with say 40 bushel corn at $5 a week or $5 price, right? So it's sometimes it gets a little convoluted. In my mind, it's kind of like livestock leases. There's really only two ways I've ever seen them. They are either unfair, but they're simple, or they're complicated. They may be fair, but they're so complicated nobody really knows what's what's going on. So I'd also argue if you have a situation where you are a tenant that owns a sprinkler, you really ought to know what these costs are, because I know natural gas had kind of been cheap, but there's still an investment cost to maintaining the $120,000 sprinkler, right? So I know insurance has gone up on it too as well. So important, again, like Kyle said, we're using general numbers here, but again, I think the key is understanding your cost of production, knowing exactly what yours is to dictate this. So let's see here, with the landlord helping out with some of the fertilizer, again, we're closer to this 65 65-35 arrangement. Again, cash rent kind of pushing at 235. Again, probably pushing into that eastern side of the association with higher cash rent values there. And again, even though they net loss, we're closer to an equitable lease arrangement when that landlord is helping out with the chemical there. So again, notice the difference here. Now we have the example, the tenant owns the sprinkler. So if he's paying for 100% share of the cost, that bumps up to, a 70, 71%, right? Equitable lease arrangement, 2/3, 1/3 when they're paying their share of the fertilizer, the landlord is. And then like a 65, 25 there with them helping out with, or excuse me, 65, 35 with them both paying their share of the fertilizer and chemicals. So yeah, I'll leave that with open-ended questions there and roll from there.